Knud Magnusson did not die honorably in battle. He would instead die at a feast held to end a series of bloody civil wars in Denmark. According to one of the later medieval accounts, the first sword blow would split King Knud's head down the middle. Another tradition says armed men would rush the unprepared, unarmed, and defenseless guests, and they would subsequently run Knud through with a sword, killing him. His kinsman, Constantine, was killed beside him. Valdemar, the third king in the room, was struck and wounded, but he managed to force his way out into the darkness and flees. Absalon, his foster brother, would escape the same killing, only narrowly. 3 Danish kings had come to Roskilde under a settlement sworn in peace. Before their celebration was over, one would now be a corpse, one would be bleeding and in flight, and the third was already fighting to control the story of what had happened. Saxo Grammaticus tells us that by the following morning, King Sven would appear before the people of Roskilde with a slashed cloak. He would claim that Knud and Valdemar had intended to murder him. Valdemar would answer from Jylland by displaying his own wounds before an assembly at Viborg. Cloak against flesh, claim against claim. A massacre inside a royal hall would become the final argument in a civil war that had consumed Denmark already for more than a generation. This event is known to us today as the Bloodfeast of Roskilde. While the name is a later invention, possibly for a dramatic effect, the bloody violence and the consequences for the Kingdom of Denmark is very real. On August 9th, 1157, during celebrations connected with a division of Denmark between Svend, Knud, and Valdemar, Sven's followers attacked the other kings. Knud would be killed, Valdemar would escape wounded, and within 11 weeks, Sven too would be dead, and Valdemar would possess the whole Kingdom of Denmark. But this scene, perhaps to some of you a familiar one, with the precise room and the dying light, the chessboard, the extinguished candles, and the dramatic positions of every sword, is not exactly an eyewitness record. It's a reconstruction assembled from chronicles written under the later Victorious dynasty, or from traditions heavily influenced by that same dynasty. To tell this story properly and accurately, we have to begin with the murder that made Valdemar an orphan and embroiled Denmark in a succession of civil wars. Denmark in the 12th century was a kingdom, but it did not yet possess a simple and universally accepted law of succession. Kings normally came from a royal family, and yet birth alone did not automatically settle any matter. A claimant required recognition from leading men, as well as acclamation at the regional assemblies known as Landsting. More than one prince could possess royal blood at the same time, and more than one claimant could gather supporters in their cause, and more than one man could be hailed as a king. This didn't make Denmark permanently anarchic, but it did mean that succession depended upon negotiations and reputations, and upon military power and kinship, and as well as that, alliances among bishops and leading men and magnates. A king who could not keep those alliances could lose much more than political support. He could lose the kingdom itself, or even worse, his life. The royal family at this point in time had become dangerously broad. The sons and grandsons of earlier kings would form competing branches, each able to claim their own descent and dignity and their own followers. When no single candidate dominated, an election could mean infighting and eventual war, and a war could later be presented as an election confirmed by the divine god himself. The crisis that eventually led to Roskilde began on the 7th of January, 1131. In Haraldsted Skov, outside Ringsted, Magnus, son of the reigning King Niels, would kill his cousin Knud Lavard. Modern historians generally interpret the murder as an attempt to remove a formidable rival before the next royal succession. Knud was himself an experienced prince connected to powerful Danish families, successful on the southern frontier, and established as a ruler of the Oberdreiz under the authority of the German king. He had with him the prestige that Magnus feared he might not be able to defeat in a future election. Knud's half-brother Erik Emune raised a rebellion against Niels and Magnus. The first civil war lasted until 1134, when Magnus was killed at Fulvi, and King Niels was murdered soon afterwards in Slesvig. Erik Emune became king, only to be murdered himself in 1137. His successor, Erik Lam, eventually restored a measure of peace, but in 1146 he would abdicate his throne and enter a monastery as a monk. He would leave no legitimate sons to impose an uncontested succession. Knud Magnusson was the son of Magnus, the man who had killed Knud Lavard. Sven Aggesen, later called Svend Grathe, was the son of Erik Emune, the avenger of Knud Lavard. Valdemar was Knud Lavard's son, and these three claimants were then tied together by blood and murder, as well as vengeance and a sort of inheritance before any of them was even old enough to choose any quarrels for themselves. When Erik Lamp withdrew in 1146, different parts of the kingdom would support different men. Svend was acclaimed in Sjælland and Skåne, and meanwhile Knud found his principal support in Jylland. Their rival elections would reopen the civil wars in Denmark. While Valdemar was still young, he did not begin to struggle as Knud's ally. He initially supported Svend's claim to the throne. This alliance was not an irrational one, as Svend's father had fought to avenge Knud Lavard, while Knud Magnusson was the son of Knud Lavard's own killer. The later histories of the Valdemars would have to work carefully around this very inconvenient fact. The son of the present-day murdered saint standing first beside one rival, and then later finding common ground with the murderer's very own son. The fighting would move between regions and alliances, and Svend would defeat Knud more than once. The rivals would seek outside help from Saxon, Holsten, Sweden, and the German monarchy. Denmark's civil war was not sealed off from Europe, and control of the Danish crown affected the southern Baltic, the frontier at Slesvig, and the balance of power among the German princes. In 1152, Svend, Knud, and Valdemar appeared within the political orbit of the newly elected German king, Frederick Barbarossa. The settlement associated with the assembly at Massenburg favored Svend. Frederick recognized him as the king of Denmark, with Knud set to receive substantial lands in Denmark, and Valdemar to receive the position connected with his father's former rule in Slesvig. The arrangement also placed Danish kingship within an imperial language of lordship and as well a fealty, as we would see later, that was itself politically explosive. Yet a judgment delivered abroad could not command Denmark if the men at home refused to sustain it. Svend's position would weaken, and the details are difficult to ascertain because Saxo's account is profoundly hostile and greatly biased at times, and it also portrays Svend as an arrogant ruler who had insulted the Danish customs, who had elevated unworthy favorites to high positions, and also alienated the magnates who had raised him to the same power he now held. Modern historians are therefore cautious about accepting Saxo's catalogue of abuses quite literally, but he is still an incredibly important source. The political result is not called into question, however. Svend had lost important supporters, and Valdemar had changed sides. In 1154, he would join Knud. The new alliance would be sealed by Valdemar's engagement to Knud's half-sister, Sophie. Knud and Valdemar were acclaimed as kings at Viborg, while Svend would flee to Germany. This reversal was extraordinary. Valdemar had abandoned the very man that he had served under previously and would now ally himself with the son of his own father's killer. But in a political culture built upon personal bonds, reconciliation like this could create a new obligation as powerful as any inherited vengeance. For several years after Denmark effectively belonged to Knud and Valdemar. Svend, however, had not renounced his crown and had no plans to do so, and in the winter of 1156-57, Svend would return with German support and attempted to recover his kingdom by force. His campaign in Jylland failed. The war had again reached a point in which no claimant could destroy the others without further devastation. The leading men of the kingdom and the church appear to have pressed them for a settlement. Helmold of Passau gave Bishop Elias of Ribe a prominent role in these negotiations. Other sources speak more generally of the magnates, but the essential point is shared. The three kings did not independently discover brotherly affection. They were instead pushed towards a peace because Denmark had been exhausted by their infighting. We arrive now in the summer of 1157, with the three claimants agreeing to divide the kingdom amongst them. The exact formulation varies slightly in the surviving reconstructions, but the broad settlement is very clear. Valdemar would receive Jylland, and Knud would receive Sjælland, Fyn, and the other associated islands, and Svend would receive Skåne and the eastern provinces of Denmark. And in the end, each man would retain an individual title of king over their respective provinces. The arrangement was not as absurd to the contemporaries at the time as it may appear to us today. Medieval kingdoms would and could very often be divided equally among rulers, and any shared or regional kingship was not actually unknown at all, as had been the case with the previous Carolingian and even earlier Roman empires, for instance. The settlement also corresponded to the territories and networks in which each claimant possessed popular support. It would offer an alternative to another costly and long drawn-out campaign of battles and sieges and burned estates and broken allegiances, as well as thousands of dead, innocent people. But a partition between three kings would require much more than just words. Peace would have to be performed often and publicly. Oaths had to be sworn again and again, and enemies would have to eat together, drink together, and demonstrate before their followers that their hostilities had indeed ended. Now, a royal banquet was not merely a dinner, it was a form of political ritual. The seating arrangements would display the ranks, and the food and drink would express the generosity, and the sharing of a table would convert enemies into guests, and would place them under obligations of hospitality. The sources preserve uncertainty over who hosted the Roskilde celebrations. Sven Aggesen says that Sven was the host, and sources favorable to Valdemar make Knud the host, thus intensifying the outrage by turning him into a man murdered beneath his own hospitality. Lars Kjær, one of my previous professors, has suggested a plausible solution. The kings may have taken turns entertaining one another, a practice that would have preserved equality between the rulers. A sort of melkloop that many Danes might find themselves familiar with. And it's also a ritual harkening back to the Spartan tradition of the Syssidia. Even the length of the celebration varies amongst the sources. The Knýtlinga saga places the attack on the second day of the feast, Helmold places it on the third, beginning as the darkness fell on the guests, and meanwhile Saxo builds an elaborate evening scene. These differences prevent an exact reconstruction from the contemporary sources, but they don't erase the central fact that the kings were feasting under a settlement of peace when armed men attacked in one form or another. The peace had at this point removed the victims' greatest protection. They were not expecting a battle. Valdemar's own charter, issued shortly afterwards, names him as unarmed and unsuspecting. In his own words, he says, "Best as I was sitting and enjoying a festive meal, leading friendly conversation, the faithless men that I had been sitting with sought suddenly to run me through, me, an unarmed man, fearing no such thing." The later Knýtlinga saga similarly says that the men inside would carry no weapons because no breach of peace was to be expected. Helmold describes the royal guests as free from any fear and suspicion. The trust itself had made these men targets. The earliest concise confirmation of the Bloodfeast comes from the Annals of Magdeburg. These were written before the great Danish court histories. The entry states that Knud was treacherously killed by Sven and that Valdemar escaped with difficulty after himself being wounded, and that Sven would later be defeated, captured, and cut down. The annals give no chessboards, no speeches, and no heroic choreography. It just gives us the bare bones of the event. Helmold of Bossau, writing in the 1160s, is closer in time than Saxo's writings. Yet, even Helmold's version of the final Danish struggle appears to draw upon materials circulated from Valdemar's own court, rife with bias. Rikke Malmros demonstrated that his wording and structure share features with the official Valdemarian tradition. Nearness in time does not automatically mean political independence or any free speech. In the Knýtlinga saga, the three kings sit together in a guest house, playing chess and making merry, while their followers amuse themselves outside. Sven suddenly receives a secret signal and briefly leaves the gathering. His men then enter, swords drawn against the unarmed guests. The saga says that Knud's head was split by a single blow, while Valdemar survives the assaults and escapes, however wounded. Saxo constructs a darker and more theatrical sequence. The light fades, armed followers enter, blades are drawn, Knud is struck down, mortally wounded, Constantine is killed, and Valdemar is wounded. Confusion is rife in the hall, and the extinguishing of the lights help the survivors to break away. Saxo's version gives Absalon a far greater role than the earlier evidence permits, almost turning the episode into the remembered experience of this future archbishop. The specific wounds cannot be harmonized with confidence. In one tradition, Knud is run through by a sword, and in another his skull is cleaved and shattered. Valdemar himself is threatened by a blow to the head in one account, and in another he's only wounded in the leg, with later tradition locating it specifically in his thigh. These are precisely the details that a filmmaker might want, and ones that a responsible historian must mark as incredibly uncertain. The details that we can verify are themselves brutal enough. Armed men enter a peaceful royal celebration with deadly weapons of war. Knud would be killed in close quarters and Constantine would die with him. Valdemar was struck and bled and subsequently fled the whole scene. The attackers failed to finish this last rival before he escaped and eventually reached Jylland. Sven had succeeded in removing one king, but he had not removed this witness whose body could be used against him. According to Saxo, Svend appeared before the people of Roskilde the next morning, displaying his cloak that he had secretly cut himself. His claim was that Knud and Valdemar had plotted against him and that the violence enacted had been defensive in nature. Now, it's important to note that we cannot independently verify the staged cloak or the exact speech, but what matters is that the surviving tradition remembered an alternative explanation from Svend, and remembered it partly only to discredit it. Valdemar's response was much more successful. After reaching Jylland, he would appear before the assembly at Viborg. The later accounts say that he exposed his wounds, and his resulting speech would move the gathering to tears. His damaged body supplied something that Svend's cut cloak could not, a living demonstration that the attack had been directed against him, and not Svend. This was not an ornamental episode, because Valdemar needed the forces of Knud to join his side. He needed them to accept the former ally of Svend as Knud's now avenger and political heir. And the appeal worked. Followers of the dead king would rally to Valdemar, while some men in turn would also abandon Svend. The alliance was reinforced by dynasty. Valdemar's earlier engagement to Sophie, Knud's half-sister, now joined the claims and networks of the dead king to the surviving one. Their eventual marriage did not simply unite two people, but it helped to further absorb Knud's following and inheritance into Valdemar's own cause. The massacre therefore created a sort of paradox. If Svend ordered it to clear the path to sole kingship, he achieved quite the opposite. He had killed the weaker partner in an alliance, but he had left the stronger partner alive and wounded, as well as outraged, and able to claim this dead man's supporters, and in turn, fight back. Yet victory was not predetermined, as it often isn't. Svend still controlled the vast eastern resources, and he retained a substantial following himself. He would later assemble forces in Sjælland and Skåne, he would cross to Jylland, and he would pursue the war. Valdemar gathered men around Viborg and prepared for this battle that would decide whether the Bloodfeast had become a successful coup or just simply an unforgivable crime. In medieval political thought, the result of the battle could be interpreted as divine judgment. Victory did not merely reveal the stronger army, but it could be made to reveal the justice of the victor's cause. At Grathe Hede, Valdemar would ultimately win this kingdom, and with his victory, he would win the proof that his version of the Roskilde bloodbath was true. On October 23, 1157, Svend and Valdemar's armies would meet on Grathe Hede, south of Viborg. The tactical story comes mainly from much later narratives and should not really be burdened with invented numbers or formations, as we can never really be sure of the numbers. What we know for certain is that Svend had brought an army into Jylland and that Valdemar opposed them, and that this engagement would possibly end in the collapse of Svend's cause. The battle is remembered as the final judgment of these many civil wars. Later Valdemarian writing framed Svend's defeat as divine justice against a perjurer. A singer in Saxo's account reminded Valdemar's men of the faithless murders at Roskilde. The battlefield was made into a tribunal, and Svend's death into the sentence carried out. The earliest German annal says that Svend was captured while fleeing and later cut down. Later Danish tradition says that he lost his weapons and armor in the marshy ground and was killed by a mere peasant. The identity of the killer is less secure even than the outcome, but Svend would have died during or immediately after the rout of his army, and his body would be buried near Grathe, and the place supplied the name by which posterity would remember him. Svend had now joined Knud in death, with only Valdemar remaining. The new king's conduct after the victory was important. Modern reconstructions describe an effort at stabilization rather than just indiscriminate purges, and most former opponents were instead reconciled. The men held responsible for Knud's murder were, of course, executed, with some advisors instead being exiled, but the point was political as much as it was a point of mercy. Valdemar could not govern Denmark solely with the faction that had followed him into battle. He needed men who had served Knud, and he needed men who had served Svend alike. Within months of the battle, Valdemar would place his interpretation into an official royal charter. The foundation document for Vitskøl Abbey survives only through the later copies, but the text belongs close to the events, and it's the nearest thing that we possess to Valdemar's own public account. The charter doesn't name Svend or Knud or Roskilde, but instead it describes unnamed faithless men who had shared a festive meal and friendly conversations with the king, who suddenly drew swords and attempted to pierce him while he himself stood unarmed and unsuspecting. The implications of this is that God alone would rescue Valdemar from the armed crowd. The enemies then gathers perjurers and rebels and all the rabble and criminals of the society, and they renew open war, intending to deprive Valdemar of his life and his kingdom, and the Danish people of their peace. In this case, God fights for the king, and his enemies are destroyed together with the author of the crime. This is a royal document of thanksgiving and legitimacy. Its value lies partly in that very purpose. It shows just how rapidly Valdemar sought to write and define the conflict himself. He was the divinely protected king, and his enemies were oath-breakers and attempted usurpers. Victory was providential. His own kingship instead meant peace and divinity. This charter was witnessed in an imposing political setting by Archbishop Eskil, as well as 6 bishops and some abbots, magnates, and what the documents just call countless others. The story was proclaimed in the presence of the kingdom's leading institutions and therefore attached to a more permanent religious foundation. Malmros traced echoes of this language through to later Danish writing, and Sven Aggesen, the continuation of the Roskilde Chronicle, and in the traditions preserved in the Knýtlinga saga, as well as the accounts transmitted abroad. They all reproduce the same architecture at their basic core. Valdemar's wounded escape, the ensuing war, the death of Svend in battle, and peace restored by this victor. This means that the Valdemarian court succeeded in establishing the narrative framework within which the history could be written by the victor. The alternative history had lost its patron, and it had lost its archive, and it had lost its king at Grathe Hede. Several decades later, Saxo Grammaticus turned the events into their most enduring form, which still survives to us today. At this point in time, Saxo was writing in the world largely created by Valdemar's victory. His great victory was connected to Archbishop Absalon, Valdemar's foster brother, and his commander, as well as his bishop and his political partner, all in one. Absalon had been present at this Roskilde feast, but Saxo magnified his part until the massacre could be read almost as Absalon's own remembered drama. Saxo's account is invaluable, make no mistake. It preserves names and speeches as well as political arguments, but it also preserves a narrative of extraordinary literary power within this Danish kingdom. It's also a work of classical history, court ideology, and of moral judgment. Saxo himself shapes rulers according to virtues and vices, and he turns loyalty and treason into later explanations for political legitimacy. Sven becomes the faithless tyrant, while Valdemar becomes the ruler whose patience and courage, as well as his concern for the fatherland, justify his survival. The Knýtlinga saga, composed later in Iceland in the 13th century, would provide an alternative arrangement of the scene, but it's still not a clean escape from Valdemarian propaganda and influence. Modern scholarship has identified close connections between the saga and the reigning Danish historical tradition, perhaps through a shared lost source unknown to us today. The saga's chess game and afternoon setting cannot simply be treated as independent eyewitness detail. Even Helmund's earlier narrative reflects information that appears to have traveled from Valdemar's circle itself. The agreement among the sources is therefore both reassuring and at the same time kind of dangerous. It strongly supports the central sequence of events in the story, but it does not create several independent witnesses to every detail. What survives to us is history written under the conditions produced by the victory. Sven's reputation would be reduced to nothing but a crime and a place of death, while Knud became the innocent victim, whose memory could be neatly incorporated into Valdemar's own later dynasty. Valdemar would also become the wounded survivor and the avenger, and a sort of divinely appointed harbinger of peace. Absalon became the companion to Valdemar through whom the story could be carried into the intellectual project of this new kingdom. While the Bloodfeast was not invented by Saxo, he gave it the moral architecture through which later generations would attempt to understand it. It's important to note that Valdemar's sole kingship did not instantly create a peaceful, modern, centralized state that flourished for thousands of years, nor did one evening feast abolish this elective character of Danish monarchy. The transformation would happen much slower. But the events of 1157 would remove these rival kings who had made a divided realm possible in the first place. Valdemar would attempt to rebuild royal authority with the support of Absalon and the other bishops, as well as a coalition of powerful families. Valdemar would reward his allies, and he would reconcile his former enemies, and he would strengthen the defense of his kingdom, and he would also present his dynasty as the guardian of peace. The memory of Knud Lavard becomes central to this program. Valdemar's father was formally canonized in 1169, and in 1170 his shrine was elevated at Ringsted, while Valdemar's son Knud was crowned as Medkongen, a title essentially establishing him as the junior king, thus designating him as the official successor in line to the throne. Sanctity, coronation, and genealogy worked together to narrow the field of legitimate successors. The dynasty that arose from a murdered father and his wounded son now sought to prevent Denmark from returning to the same open contest. Later generations would remember Valdemar as the Great, but that title should not be projected backwards into the halls of Roskilde. In August of 1157, he was not yet the unquestioned savior of Denmark. He was just one of 3 kings, and he was a man who had previously changed alliances and who had accepted a partition of his kingdom as his own personal realm. His escape did not reveal a destiny already written in the stars, but it created an opportunity that he would use with exceptional political skill. Sven should not be converted into a misunderstood hero merely because the surviving sources are hostile to him. The independent core of the evidence still point towards Knud being killed by Sven's side under a presumption or settlement of peace. Nor can the exact conspiracy be reconstructed beyond any reasonable doubt. We don't possess Sven's archive, or his own narrative, or really any of his words on this matter, and we don't know the full instructions given to the attackers, whether every participant understood the plan at hand, or even whether Sven intended a complete massacre from the moment he swore the peace. We know the attack happened, we know who it benefited in the immediate aftermath, and we know who it destroyed in the end. The honest history is therefore more unsettling than a simple tale of villains and heroes. Roskilde was both an act of political violence, while also being the beginning of a successful explanation of that violence. The swords killed Knud, and the victory at Grathe killed Sven. The chronicles later decided what both deaths meant. 3 kings entered the settlement of 1157 because none of them had been individually strong enough to rule Denmark on their own. At Roskilde, the peace would collapse into close-quarter killings, and Knud would fall beneath the weapons of men who had entered under the rules of royal hospitality. Valdemar would escape with a wound that would become later evidence. Sven would survive the haul, but would soon see his own part played out. At Viborg, Valdemar would turn his injury into allegiances. At Grathe Hede, he would turn allegiances into victory. At Vitskøl, and in the histories that followed, victory became providence and legitimacy to the throne, and in the end, it would become peace. The Bloodfeast was not merely Denmark's medieval equivalent to a red wedding, commonly known as a brutal banquet ending in some form of murder. It was the hinge between civil war and the later Valdemarian age, and while it destroyed one king and condemned another, it would give the lone survivor the chance to build a dynasty for himself. In the end, Sven would gamble it all and lose his crown as well as his life. Knud would lose even the possibility of ruling as well as his life, but Valdemar would ultimately win 3 times. The first, when he escaped the massacre, the second, when he won the battle, and the third, when his court would write the history. Thank you very much for watching. I would appreciate a like and a subscribe, as well as any comments, and if you have any sources or fact-checking, please drop them in the comments, and I'll answer in a pinned comment if necessary. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next one.